My name is Bilal, Sunni-Ali, and I identify myself, nationality-wise, I identify myself as a New African, and in terms of spiritual practices, I identify myself as a Muslim. I was born in 1948 AD. I was born in Harlem, New York, and I grew up in Harlem. My infant years from 1 to 5 was in Harlem, and then I grew up in the Bronx, in the Northeast Bronx specifically. And then as a teenager, traveling back and forth between Harlem and the Bronx. As a matter of fact, I identify with Harlem and the Bronx, and when I began to function with the Black Panther Party and recruit people into the Black Panther Party, the chapter we developed was the Harlem Bronx chapter, which was how a lot of people in New York, in Harlem and the Bronx, because there was a lot of people in that same space of growing up in Harlem and moving to the Bronx, or moving to the Bronx and moving back to Harlem, et cetera, et cetera. The first global response, global crisis that I can recall and identify as a global crisis was the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was an incident, and I guess I was maybe 11 or 12 years old, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, of which Moscow was the capital. So people would refer to the USSR as Russia. But that's a whole other political discussion of why it was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and why it wasn't a Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But so we'll just say Russia was a supporter of socialist and communist regimes throughout the world, and Cuba, after the Cuban Revolution, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1960, Russia was a supporter of Cuba, and Russia had supplied Cuba with missiles, nuclear missiles that was said that could put nuclear warheads into the United States. They could strike the United States, and the United States, when that was detected that there were nuclear missiles in Cuba, the United States demanded that they be taken out of Cuba. I think the Cuban Communist Party and the Cuban government refused to have them moved. However, the decision came to rest upon Russia, who had placed them there. So it became a conflict between the United States and Russia, with Cuba as a possible space where the United States, if they were going to strike out against Russia in this instance, they were going to strike Cuba. So that became a crisis that the world was quite aware of it, and I was quite aware of it because my older brother was in the Navy, and he was stationed in Key West, Florida, in telecommunications. He was a radio man, so he was in fact receiving and sending messages between Navy intelligence and Russian intelligence. And so I became acutely aware of it because of that relationship, more so than just the average person in the neighborhood, who was hearing about the Cuban crisis. I was hearing about it from a whole different angle, and it increased my political understanding of the world, because as we, the general population, were aware that this was a situation that could be devastating. It could be war right there in the Caribbean, and the United States could be bombing or sending troops and to a Caribbean country in which we understood at that time were not only our neighbors but our relatives. My father made me understand that we had blood relatives that lived in Cuba. So this was that it increased my political understanding of the world. And then, being that my brother was in it, my brother told me that in terms of day to day, his work in telecommunications, as a radio man, he saw such instances happening maybe 12 times a day with different parts of the world. Even though this was acutely ours, because this was like, wow, we lived in a country that was threatening the lives of our neighbors and threatening the lives of our relatives.
So what were some of the responses of the elders in your life to this threat?
I remember mainly that they prayed, and we need to pray that this that this situation doesn't escalate and doesn't lead to warfare, and especially doesn't lead to bombing, because if they had this was 1960, and just maybe 6 to 8 years prior to that, they had experienced the Korean conflict, which is a conflict again primarily between the United States and Russia, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and using Korea as the proxy, or as the territory in which the ground war would be fought and lives would be lost there. And so that taught me something too, that these two countries were challenging each other, but they were not going to fight a war or bomb each other. It was that they were gonna bomb in Cuba. They were gonna bomb our relatives. In Korea, they were gonna bomb people who didn't look like us, but who looked more like us than they looked like them. So, that was an understanding that I grasped at the time too, because people were talking. I didn't remember the Korean War as much, because I was only about 4 or 5 years old when that conflict was taking place, but I was 11 or 12 years old when the Cuban crisis Cuban Missile Crisis was taking place. So I was much more aware of it. So we used to have, but I remember, besides my own elders in my family, the general population used to have air raid drills where we would practice. A signal would be set off in school, and we would practice getting under the desk, or we would practice lining up and going out into the hallway, and then out of the classroom into the hallway and lining up, and sometimes going down into what they called an air raid shelter. And they had, they used to have fire drills where we would practice, going into the hallway and going into safety. And this air raid drill was another level. Then we understood the fire drill was in case of fire. We would be practicing how we would respond. But this was how we would respond in place of an air attack or possibly nuclear attack from another country. And the country that it was thought to be most likely to launch an air raid attack on the United States was Russia. There was not an immediate jump between the time of experiencing the Cuban Missile Crisis, because there were also local crises that developed out of the freedom movement. For instance, there were stores in Harlem. There were stores in Harlem in the Bronx that didn't hire black people. So there would be demonstrations in front of those stores. And sometimes we would take part in those demonstrations, and sometimes there would be violence erupted. So that was like local police military crisis that we experienced, which would sometimes result in curfew, meaning that there would be a certain time we would have to be off the street. At night there would be demonstrations in the day, but demonstrations would take place in the day, and in the nighttime curfew would exist where people had to be off the street in certain designated areas. And our parents and our elders responded by telling us, that we needed to stay off the streets, and we need not be come in conflict with whether we were involved in the demonstrations, which they were in agreement with, whether we were involved in them or not. We need not be involved in any nighttime activity which would put us in conflict with the police or National Guard, as it would sometimes be National Guard. So this was like during my later teenage years. And also there were local neighborhood crises in which we would have what's called gang wars, where we would be in conflict with people in another neighborhood. It would usually be white neighborhoods and white people from white neighborhoods, because most of we would practice what we would call sham battles in the projects and in the neighborhood, where we would actually choose sides and fight each other for practice of how we would respond if there was a battle with another neighborhood or with another race of people. So that was learning. That was again learning the political, the political structure and how the power structure favored the white race, and learning about that there was privileges to being white, even though they were in neighborhoods like ours, even though they were in they lived in the projects. I grew up primarily in the Eastchester projects in the Northeast Bronx, and it was white people who grew up there, and we had the same economic level, but we had different racial perspectives, and we could see that the police favored them. Whenever there was a conflict, the police was more on their side. They were more side and more so trying to quell our disturbance and curtail us more so than curtail them. They wanted to curtail the disturbance, but conflicts between white groups and other white groups, and black groups and other black groups, and black groups and white groups, would definitely, we could see the difference in how the authorities would respond to us. And then there was another military crisis in the Dominican Republic. I don't remember what the social dynamics and political dynamics going on in the Dominican Republic were, but I do know that older brothers in the neighborhood who were in the Marines, were sent to the Dominican Republic to put down the disturbance. And we saw that as the police putting down the disturbance in the neighborhood, because, part of the black community were black people from the Dominican Republic, and so that became a thing of political awareness. We would ask them, you really, what do you do when you get over there and they tell you to shoot these brothers? That's like shooting Brother Cortez or Brother Gomez over there around the corner. That's and that's when people's political conscience began to develop. Because I remember people saying, well, they'd shoot at me, so I shoot back. And then other people saying, well, we got to look at this. And then the next level of conflict was the Vietnam War. The war in Vietnam, where we had older brothers in the neighborhood. And then we were next in line to be drafted and going, but older brothers who were like 3 or 4 years older than myself, or I'm 6 years younger than my older brother. So people between his age, people who had been in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and people involved in the Vietnam War, and people who had been involved in the Dominican crisis, there was this flow right down to our age group of and by then we were more engaged in the Black freedom movement. So it wasn't no longer in the naivety that you found during the Dominican Republic crisis and the Vietnamese crisis, because by then people understood that we identified the United States as a white country and who was sending black people to fight Asian people. And we identified Asians as oppressed people, as we saw their neighborhoods similar to our neighborhoods in the States. So that was, that was a part of the activism which I grew into at that point, in which we experienced massive repression and martial law during the time of urban rebellions, and particularly in 1968 when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And and I know in New York, the urban northern areas, northern urban areas, we rebelled and we sought to retaliate, violently retaliate against the authorities as we saw it, and they responded with putting troops on the street in many areas and establishing curfew, but establishing the troops' presence on the street was all day long. The curfew went for the nighttime, but the community was occupied all day long. So sometimes violence becomes necessary in order to stop the aggressor's violence. Violence, it's self-defense. You know, people may see it as aggressive, but it's a form of self-defense where
aggression is already
where aggression is and aggression is unbearable, and aggression is unbearable. Then that form of self-defense, you know, retaliatory self-defense is, you know, it's not self-defense in the sense that you're stopping them from violence, but retaliatory self-defense is as an understanding that, hey, if we continue to do this, this is what's going to happen. People are going to break the curfew at night. There'll be certain people who will break the curfew at night, and when we can't see them, they will sneak up on us and attack us, and it could be deadly. So we need to renegotiate our stance on how we practice military tactics in certain neighborhoods.
So speaking from your revolutionary experience and your wisdom as an elder, if you could, I guess, sum it up in like bullet points or tips, what should we be doing right now?
Well, I think like what we tend to do, what we learn to grow, what we grew to learn to do in terms of responding with retaliatory violence is to become, you have to develop forces that you're able to govern yourselves, and that's where the struggle for self-determination and with community self-determination mean that we had to have people who didn't go out and respond with violence, but who actually patrol the streets. Like when the development of the Black Panther Party, there was a police the police program, which means that you would patrol the police and watch what the police would do and photograph the police in action and confront them when they were doing something wrong. And then to a more progressive form of that was to become police, either to become part of that police force or develop our own police force, and so that you would be, so that the buffer would be that now you are the person who's controlling your community, and you're the person that's controlling your community. So you wouldn't be brutal in your response to the community. You wouldn't be brutal, so that there wouldn't be outbreaks of community responding to the progressive, to the forces that's controlling them, that's policing them in a brutal way, because you wouldn't be treating them brutal. And so you develop your own apparatus to control and govern your own selves. And as much as possible, you begin to, within those apparatus, for instance, the Black Panther Party was one level, and then when I became a citizen of the Republic of New Africa, I took training in what they call the New African Security Forces. The New African Security Forcemen were encouraged to join civil defense, to join police, to join all of the apparatus of military, as well as intelligence, so that we would be aware and we'd be able to make our communities aware of different things that were going on. And I'd say that's the level that we need to operate on today. So, and that we be proactive with it. You can't wait until there's a crisis and say, "Well, I'm going to go take civil defense classes." You have to make a part of your ongoing program to take civil defense classes, or to take martial arts classes, so that you have a way of developing yourself, and the community develops a culture of developing itself. And with that culture of developing itself militarily, it's also part of developing the community's program of self-determination, politically and culturally, and educationally, socially, and with all aspects of the, taking care of all aspects of the community life. You begin to not only protest where the oppressor has discriminated against you because you're part of that society, but you begin to proactively build independent solutions to your problems, where you take care of the problems. So if you no longer have outsiders controlling the housing, but you're controlling the housing, then those conditions which you rebel against won't exist. So a whole nother level of struggle can now take place, and a level of struggle can now take place which is not a violent struggle on an everyday level, or not something that you expect to be a violent struggle. The more you proactively develop your apparatuses of self-determination, of governing ourselves, and etc., the less likelihood there is of confrontation with an outside force, because their outside activity of oppressing us is no longer as a parent and no longer as a kid.
Mm-hmm. So basically, if you stay prepared, you don't got to get prepared.
Right. And that's what because people have been asked, because people are having meetings now. For instance, people are having meetings now in the community, and I've been asked to come, but I've been told to stay at home. So it's like, well, I'm breaking a certain level of discipline if I come, and I'm showing defiance, but it's actually showing stupidity, because now this level of crisis is dealing with biological warfare. So if I come out in the street and not knowing what to expect out in the street, it's different from me staying home and knowing what to expect at home, and knowing what not to allow into the home. Is different from going out in the street and being prepared for whatever may happen, because now you have the biological warfare, or the germ warfare, or where you can be attacked not by a person with a weapon, but a weapon can be generated months in advance against you and activated at certain times, where now, like now, the where we have this. We have they've named it a COVID. I mean, what is it?
COVID-19.
COVID-19. COVID-19 has been described as a disease that is active in the street. And it lands on surfaces. It moves through the air, and so you have to protect yourself in a whole different way. And if you resist against the measures that are put in place, then there's a military consequence to resisting those measures. And you can avoid that by understanding, well, one of the things that we say, one of the ways of defending ourselves against it is our hygienic practices. So it's like, we wash our hands. As Muslims, a great part of the African community today practices Islam, and a great deal of the African community, particularly the progressive thinking aspect of the African community, practice Islam. Also practices the science of Ifa, and many of the hygienic practices, and even Christianity. Many of the hygienic practices are practices that we're told to engage in, but if we engage in these hygienic practices as a way of life, we don't engage in them because biological warfare exists. Because now biological warfare exists as a way of life. But we begin to understand that biological warfare has always existed. Yeah, it's always been plagues. It's always been things such as the nature of what's going on today has always been in the world, and we've always had to take measures to defend ourselves against those measures. And those measures have been the hygienic practices that's instilled in us by our way of life. And to make others aware of it, like people, like you tell people, so I ain't washing up. Every time you go in there, every time them guys go in there, they wash their hands. I ain't doing all that stuff. I ain't no Muslim. Or I ain't no Yoruba. I ain't no Hebrew Israelite. I ain't got to do all that. You don't have to do all that. But if you want to be safe, you have to do all that, If you want to protect yourself from what's in the air. I mean, there's bad food in the air. There's explosions that happen. There's toxins floating in the air. There's chemtrails by the planes flying over. We have chemtrails and then things float down. We have to have a certain level of awareness. But COVID-19 is like, they're counting how many people are diagnosed with it, with the condition, and the measures they're going through to take. But with chemtrails, we're not as acutely counting that. We're not acutely, because we're not politically aware of it. Some people are, and when we have intense versions of this biological warfare, then we become more acutely aware of the biological warfare that we're continuing to experience, that we've continued to experience on a low level, and so we begin more aware, and then we begin to engage in practices that protect ourselves from it and defend ourselves from it on an ongoing basis than just when we see it as a crisis. The convenience of American society, of what's considered modern, industrialized society, it's important to understand that that's not the world society, and so we need to take time out, because it's not that very far away. We're in the rural areas of even an industrialized society. You're in a different age. Even in New York, it's industrialized. If you go in like the small towns and villages of New York and Long Island, you may find people not using toilet paper, or using it very scarcely, or having drinking water, or being able to go to the store, as people are able to go to the store in the more industrialized the area, the more these things take place, of we call conveniences, but they're actually inconvenient dependencies that make us unhealthy. And once we look at it as, these convenience stores are inconvenient stores, they're inconvenient centers that will have us engaging in practices that are not healthy for us to engage in on an ongoing basis. And so it helps us to turn our minds around. So when you practice survival, you're practicing living without the so-called conveniences. That's exactly what you're practicing. Living without having a convenience store 24/7 within walking distance or short riding distance on a bicycle or an automobile from wherever you live. And this type of practice is important because it helps us to develop ways of how you're going to respond when the convenience stores are shut down, or when you are not allowed to go to the convenience stores 24/7 because there's something in the air. There's something in the air on an ongoing basis, and we don't know if this is going to be in the air several hours. Sometimes it may be several hours where you can't go outside your house, or maybe several days, or maybe several weeks, or maybe several months. Right now we're facing a situation where it may be several months where we can't go out. And we should look at it as it may be several months. It may be several months for some people, but for the like, for instance, for the elderly, on which I'm at that age or quickly approaching that age, it may be several months. What may be several weeks for some person, maybe several weeks, several months for me, because I'm vulnerable, but I'm continuously vulnerable, and so that's what we need to understand and develop in practices of self-determination. Develop ways where we can function, and it becomes a normal way to function. It becomes our normal way of life to function without the conveniences, to function whereas I'm not going to participate in the society as it's presented to me to participate, because that's the form of capitalism. It's called for spending money at a certain level and making money at a certain level. So we're organized under capitalism and 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 socialism becomes foreign to us. People curse the idea of being able to function on what you need to function on, and not having an abundance of things that you don't that are not necessarily, and understanding that makes you unhealthy. I'm referring to all forms of health: your mental health, your spiritual health, as well as your physical health. It's because they impact on each other. Your emotional health, like we take a specific condition as asthma. It's a physical condition, but we know of there's emotional stimulus to that physical condition. And the emotional stimulus to that physical condition, you can erase yourself from having those emotional stimuluses in your daily practice, in your daily routine. You can develop a way of life that you don't experience those emotional stimuli, because and it's healthy. It's healthy to do that. And just using asthma as an example. But I hope people can learn from this situation, because every situation is training for a next situation. Those who were prepared during Katrina are more prepared now. Those who weren't prepared during Katrina are not prepared now, even less so. And it goes on and on. Those who were prepared during Katrina, those who were prepared during the emergency in Ferguson, those who were prepared during the Gulf oil leak, the leaking of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. People who were not prepared for that crisis are not prepared for the crisis as it impacts on them now. So we need to understand these crises as they happen, and understand particularly that the overall general society is involved in capitalism, and capitalism rules, and capitalism creates these dangers. Whereas now we're facing a point where people are saying, well, it would be better to go back to work, and some people may die, but we will save the economy. And people are so indebted, so accustomed to capitalism, that they say, I mean, for the sake of saving the economy, we may lose a few people, or we may lose a lot of people. And that's the way it'll be. But we can develop another way of life. We can and we need to develop another way of life and another way of thinking, so that we're not faced with this crisis situation over and over again.
I'll say.
The older I get, the better I know that the secrets of my going on. It's when the reins are in the hands of the young who dare to run against the storm. All right. Peace. Be the man.
All right. Peace. Be the man.